Let's head into the last empty places with author Peter Stark and broadcaster Jimmy Mack. A podcast about the adventure of getting lost to find yourself. Join Peter and Jimmy as they head into places where sometimes the only lights are the stars, and the only guide, your wits.
I'm here with Peter Stark, of course, author of The Lost Cities of El Norte, Coronado's Quest, The Unconquered West, and The Birth of American Indian Resistance. I'm Jimmy Mack, and of course we're here for Last Empty Places, an exploration of those out-of-the-way places in America with a particular focus on what it means to get lost. How you doing? Good to see you.
Good. Great to see you.
I brought up the book because, you and I have been on our own set of road adventures, not like into the wilderness, although it might be a wilderness of the mind. I have to ask you, the book has been out. We're closing in on the 14th of May. It'll be a month since its release. How has the book tour been going? What have you been doing?
Oh, man, it's been a crazy whirlwind. I feel like I'm doing laps around the Southwest and then laps around the West Coast and then laps around the Northwest and then coming home and then doing another lap and then coming home and doing another lap. So that's essentially what I've been doing. I'm in between lap 2 and 3 right now. I've been giving bookstore readings in Santa Fe at Collected Works and Albuquerque at Bookworks, and then over in Los Angeles at the Autry Museum of the American West, which is a very cool museum for people who are in that area or visiting that area. And then I went up to Oregon and it was a members only talk at the Oregon Historical Society. And that was great. There were like over 200 paying audience members for that one. And then I did more bookstores around Puget Sound, and then I'm back home. So yeah, it's going really well. The audiences have been enthusiastic. It's been fun to have this interaction with them, kind of kicking these concepts around. And on the publishing side, it's been really good too. That the book, my Lost Cities book, made the bestseller list of the Mountain and Plains Booksellers Association, which covers the kind of like the whole West. And then also of the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association. And that's just happened in the last couple of weeks. And it got a big review, a really good one in the Wall Street Journal by Peter Cousins, who's a fellow writer of early American history. So yeah, lots of things keep popping up, and every day there's some new opportunity that pops up. So yeah, it's going great, basically.
Yeah, and the other reason I was thinking, have you done any, I hate to ask this question, have you done any Barnes and Nobles?
No, I haven't. No, I haven't. But usually my published targets.
Yeah, your audiences, I understand that. We're talking about audiences where we're talking about, organizations a lot of the time and these kind of local bookstores where there's a real kind of passion for the kind of stuff you write. So it's not just a matter of going and hoping you can kind of drum up the action. These are kind of sought after places that really kind of play to a target audience that you have. So while you have a nice audience, it is a very specific kind of audience, isn't it? It's like there's a certain kind of guy and gal and thal, as I sometimes call people, who kind of fall into that category. I only asked about the Barnes & Noble thing because I don't know if you've seen this. Barnes & Noble actually is undergoing this giant renaissance. I don't know if you heard about this, the idea that they opened up more stores all around the country. They brought in this British, the new CEO is a guy from Britain who ran, is it Wellstone, the bookstore out of England?
Oh,
I think
okay,
that's, yeah. They brought him in, and he had this crazy idea that each branch of Barnes & Noble should be more like a local bookstore, that they should give the branch managers more leeway to kind of order the books that they want for the people that actually come in. If you have a lot of kids coming in, make your kids section bigger. If you have a lot of teens coming in, make the young adult and the Barnes & Noble, Starbucks there bigger, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There seems to be, and from what you're saying, 200 people sold out, there seems to be this hunger. So many people spend their life both either at work or at home and no place else. There seems to be a hunger for third spaces. And it seems like on this tour, with the kind of response you're getting, is that people often look at a book or a book about adventure in particular as a place to kind of gather to find a third space.
It's a community in effect.
Yeah, I mean,
And in
essentially,
fact, I read at a bookstore in the Seattle area. You probably know it. It's called Third Place Books.
oh yeah.
They have a couple of branches, and so at least a couple. So, but I think exactly what you're saying is that it's a place where people, I mean, like literally hang out and find a community, not only in the bookstore itself, but in the books they encounter there. So, I and I hope this Lost Cities book it gathers its own community. It certainly has a lot of enthusiasts at this point. People have read it, so they really love it.
We're actually going to do I promise you, we're going to do a show where you and I talk about the book. I still got plenty of questions and I got plenty of thoughts. I don't mean like I have, when I say questions and thoughts, I don't mean it in the way that people say when they're in a critical writing class. I mean, like I'm enthusiastic and excited to talk about the book. The other thing is too, is the fact, did you ever think about that like 20 years ago, the idea that this is such a cool thing? The book itself becomes not metaphorically, but literally a map to community. Because you read this book and then you say, man, I like this book. I wonder who else likes this book. I wish I could find people who like this kind of book so I could have these kind of conversations. And then you hear that you're coming to town and you become a waypoint for all these people to follow the map of your book, to come meet you, to meet each other, to form that community, which is a really cool thing. And the idea that it's like that certain works, and that's another show we should do, by the way, that certain works of fiction, certain works of historical importance become kind of these community building tomes.
Right.
They create community. And, and it just, has it ever hit you that like literally the books that you have written have created an entire community of people?
A couple of them, yes. That it's really distinctly that the book I wrote came out in 2014. It's still selling really well. In fact, it sells more every year, which is wild. This is a book, Astoria, John Jacob Astor and Thomas Jefferson's Lost Pacific Empire. Talk about lost. Here we are, and now I have a book, Lost Cities. So we're really in my zone with this podcast, Last Empty Places and How to Get Lost. But yeah, so with this Astoria book, they're just people who are passionate about it, and people come up to me when I hear who I am. It's not like I have recognizable celebrity fame anywhere. Although in Portland, they don't recognize me.
Yeah, we're working on it. We're working on
it. But when people hear I wrote that book, they're like, "Oh man, I love that book." I gave it to so and so and so and so, and I hear that so often, and in a way, I hear it more and more. It's as if like the word of mouth in the last 12 years has just sort of intensified, and so people, they want to talk about it. I think they talk about it with their friends. So yes, I have that with Astoria, and then the book, which gives our podcast right here its name, Last Empty Places. It has this sort of group of adherents who are passionate about.
You're talking to one, that.
Right? Yeah. Well, right. that's how we got launched on this years ago. And that they're just some people. Just the title instantly appeals to them, and then when they read it, they get into it. But I think it's almost like they're into the concept as much as anything else, and just that's what we're trying to achieve with this podcast. Is that it's more like a concept that we're talking about. And some people instantly respond to it. So that's part of what we can do here over various episodes.
I don't know where I am, and that's okay. You know what I'm saying? I don't know where I am, and that's okay.
That's okay. Well, and I want to find those places, the empty places. I'm drawn to those. And so we're kind of defining what it is we're looking for, even though I've never been sure exactly what it is I'm looking for when I'm looking for an empty place. It's beyond just empty physically. It's sort of a metaphorical thing.
I'm gonna get really theoretical here for a second. I have a friend of mine and I who have because of my PhD studies and because some of the things that I end up finding myself talking about. You ever find yourself knowing things that you're like, why do I know that? And it's like, why do I know, French deconstructive psychology and well, Lacanian.
It wouldn't flip off of my mind.
And it's funny because there is a French theorist, psychologist, Jacques Lacan, who talks about, difference and lack and all that kind of stuff, and the idea of, that desire is everything, and that there is no attaining the desire. The only attainment of desire is the little death, as he kind of refers to it. We won't get into the details of that, but the idea that we're always kind of, in the process of desiring, and that we're never going to achieve the thing that we want to achieve. And of course, it's a very negative view of the world, and there are theoretical responses to that say, no, you've got to simply enjoy your desire, that the desire is the purpose and point, and that the idea that the longing is the purpose and point. And a lot of people don't. You often hear that glib, awful statement that everybody who's an adventurer says, it's not the destination, it's the journey. That is a very disingenuous way of putting that. I think the destination is the journey for a lot of people. And I think those are the people that you gravitate towards. There are people for whom the destination is the point. They want to go home. They want to sit in their reclining chair. They want to read their book.
They want to get us to the top of Mount Everest.
Yeah, they want to be there. They want to have that moment of savoring. They're not interested in what's going on while they're on the way up. But I think the reason why a lot of people find themselves unsatisfied when they're going someplace once they get there is because they don't realize what they really enjoy is the desire of wanting to get there as opposed to the getting there. And by the way, you can actually enjoy the contentment, the moment of respite and peace. But I think a lot of people, we talk about this mindfulness movement that's been happening over the last 20 years, people really being mindful. But I think where you are, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and where people who really go out there looking for stuff is that they stop hoping that they find it, and they realize that in the looking they have found it.
I think that's a really good point. I like the way you frame that, and that the journey is the destination. It's a famous saying, and it is true in a lot of ways. But I like the way you're reframing it as a state of desire, and that's what in a way it's what gives one's life meaning. If there were no desires and no likes and no wants and no dislikes, we'd be living in a flat, monotonal, emotional landscape. And so the desire to get to some destination is it's almost like you're drawing this emotional or mental topography, like in your own life. You're creating mountain ranges and valleys and rivers. When you have that desire of going towards a destination.
And I've been thinking about this for a couple of weeks because for those of you guys who know, Peter and I skipped a week because he's got a book tour that is going on right now. I had to drive to California and then back. I might be the only person ever to be caught in a flash flood in Arizona. That is my luck. But that trip, one of the great things is the trip back in particular. That trip really gave me kind of time to sketch out some thoughts, think about, where we're headed next. It's kind of funny, mapping out a show about getting lost. I was thinking about this, though, that there are two kinds of lost we haven't talked about that really relate. I'm just going to scratch these off my list now that we've actually arrived at this destination. There are two kinds of lost. There is the kind of lost where lost is a possibility and lost is a surprise. Do you see the difference there? The idea that if you and I together as friends go out into the Lacassine wilderness in Louisiana or go to one of the high deserts in Oregon and we lose our bearings, it's not a good thing. I mean, we're not going to be like, yay, we got lost, hooray. But we went out there properly equipped and geared with the expectation that lost was a possibility. We don't want it to happen, but we know that at some point the compass starts lying to you.
Yeah. When it starts lying to you, then you're lost.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that, being prepared to be lost is a very different place than being lost by surprise. Lost by surprise is a much more terrifying prospect. Neither one is a good thing. You don't want to be lost, even if you're set up to be lost, because you don't know how long you have before your supplies run out, even if you've geared up properly. But being lost when the expectation is that you weren't going anywhere is a very different kind of thing. And it's something that we haven't addressed on the show yet. And, I kind of reached out to you before we kind of got this episode together and said to take a look at a couple of case studies about getting lost, because the distinguishing point is the people who are going to see you speak, that intense community that is developed, as I have, around Last Empty Places, is not the same as somebody who went for a day walk with their friends and vanished in the blink of an eye. Somebody who went for a day hike in the New Hampshire trails and then was never heard from by their family again. Little boys, it happens all the time with kids playing in the exurbs or right outside the exurbs, right at the beginning of the wilderness, where kids play games and then one of the kids simply gets separated and doesn't know where he or she is. And the game kind of goes from there. And I was kind of wondering to kind of ask you the question, should we always be ready to be lost? Do you follow my question?
Yeah,
Should we always
I'm following
be
your
prepared?
question.
And are Boy Scouts, in fact, training for that? No, I'm just
right. Well, certainly when you get into a situation where you could be lost, like geographically, physically, you should be prepared for that for sure. I think I'm thinking it on both the physical level and the sort of metaphysical level. Is your question addressed to both levels, or are you talking more the physical level?
On the physical level, because the idea, it's like I used to think that my father was a lunatic, about all the kind of stuff when we would go on Boy Scout trips. He would always be so diligent, repeating stuff 3 and 4 times, and everybody else was it was the 70s. So people were just kind of running around like maniacs down to the Grand Canyon, cross Shiloh battlefields, no problem. And there's my dad being repetitive. You think, what an idiot. And then you look back at the 70s and the number of kids who wandered into the woods and never came back,
right,
because their parents had just gotten used to them wandering into the woods and coming back.
Right,
and that nobody ever had that conversation with kids or with teenagers like, look, when your parents tell you to bring a sweater, they mean it. When somebody says, hey, you might just want to have a compass in your pocket, they mean it. And it's like, do we not do that enough, particularly in this world because of cell phones and cell towers and all that? Are we as a culture not prepared to be lost?
Well, yes, I would say definitely to the last question that we are not prepared to be lost. And one of the things that really strikes me, it so much depends on the environment you're stepping into. And I'll just take it from my personal experience. I grew up in Wisconsin, in northern Wisconsin is actually like deep north woods. Southern Wisconsin is dairy farms and hills and lakes and like wood patches rather than the north woods. And I grew up, exploring around the old log cabin that we lived in, and I didn't have friends who lived nearby, so I spent a lot of my childhood, poking around in these woods and fields and swamps. And there, I knew the terrain really well, and or I learned the terrain, and so I could get my bearings. If I would get to a place where I wasn't sure where I was, but then I could go a couple of hills over, and I say, okay, now I'm oriented again. But I always knew that if I just kept walking, eventually I'd pop out in some really nice cornfield or a cow pasture. It wasn't like I was going to fall into a deep river gorge.
Right.
So then I moved to Montana, and here, like, getting lost takes on a whole different dimension, because you can wander off and never find your way back. And the most really striking thing when I got out here was that, you get in mountain weather, and you could say the same thing for deserts or for wherever, or you could say the same thing for winter, just difficult weather. You get into the mountains and it can turn so quickly from sun to sleet.
You can die of exposure in the middle of July.
You can die of exposure really easily. And as a Wisconsin boy, from growing up next to a dairy farm, coming out here and just seeing some of the consequences of that, that it was really startling. I mean, I can remember I have this vivid image when I first got out here. I was invited to go on a rafting trip, just a casual like afternoon down the river, and there were like 10 people on the raft, and it was all fun. And then like this storm moved in the afternoon, or like just a cold front. We're on this open river, and so few of the people who were not from Montana had not brought extra layers of clothing. And there was one young woman who just had her bathing suit on, and that was it. And she was so cold. She was like curled up in the fetal position at the bottom of this raft on what had been this bright, sunny, perfect day. In a matter of minutes, she was like just whimpering. And you saw how quickly it turned and how striking it was.
And you say to yourself, that's how it happens. I mean, that goes back to your book, Last Breath. I mean, it goes back to the same thing. The idea suddenly you realize, oh no, I'm in trouble. I'm in trouble. Like I said, there's a difference between getting lost of like, we shouldn't be here right now. Meaning like we're not where the map had told us we were headed towards. Oh, let's retrace our steps. Well, we got great boot gear on. We got matches. We got our compasses. We're in layered clothing. We got plenty of water. So it's like, okay, we got to retrace our steps, and we're both experienced. It's a very different place than, wait a minute, maybe I'm 45 minutes away from where I got to be, but I'm exposed.
Right.
And I'm
oh
in
man.
trouble.
Oh, I'm even now I'm very careful about that sort of thing. But where our home is in the valley, I go, hiking or jogging up these open hills just a couple of miles away. And even though it's just so nearby, there can be this whole different weather system when you go up a few hundred feet. And you think it's like, just that sunny, bright weather in the valley, and you get up there and it's just these biting winds. And you have to be ready for that. And the thing that I learned, when you talk about like being ready for any occasion, I never go out into the woods in Montana, to the mountains. If I'm out in an open field where I know the paths and when I don't bother. But I never go anywhere where there's any risk of getting caught out in some situation without a form of fire with me. That's here in this environment. That's the most important thing. I mean, you can talk about knife, you can talk about compass, you can talk about all of that, but if you can't keep yourself warm, and none of the other stuff's going to matter.
And there's so many truck drivers that I told you I had that great story where I just called and said, "What do you absolutely need?" And the number of people who called and said a pack of matches and a couple of sternos.
Yeah, a couple of sternos would be great. Yeah, I mean, and if you're in a truck, that would be ideal. That would keep you warm for sure. And in the woods here, you can be in a wet woods, and it's really hard to get a fire started. So it's good to have some kind of kindling stuff. But that's one of the things I've sort of made a lifelong, or I should say, adulthood lifelong study. No, as a kid too. It was like as a kid playing with matches when I wasn't supposed to be doing.
I always have a pack of matches on me. I always have a pack of matches on me. I'm not kidding.
To find things kindling, to find things that burn really easily. I've sort of made a lifelong study of that. And so how do you do that in a wet forest? And, in a swamp, if you're in high mountain, deep snow, how could you get a fire started? And it's one of the things I'm kind of proud about. I taught our kids how to start fires with just minimal materials, and they're kind of into the same thing. Oh, they'll try this, they'll try that, they'll try that. But it's, if you're going to be in the outdoors, it's really an essential skill to have. I can tell you stories even when you do have matches. I remember hearing an acquaintance who was fishing in early spring, and I think they were in a raft or somehow, but either one or both of them fell in the water. I think maybe one fell in the water and the other one didn't, but they dragged themselves to shore, and got out. And the guy who was a real outdoorsman, very experienced and, had everything you'd need, but he was so cold, he said there's no way he could have started a fire. that, I mean, his physically, he could not move his hands, his arms,
his digits. And when it comes to starting a fire, with the minimum you need to start a fire, even when it comes to matches, you need to have functioning digits, not just musculature, not just grit and guts. I mean, your fingers need to work.
Yeah.
I mean, it takes a real sort of skill and a whole lot of hand-eye coordination to make it happen. It can get really hairy really fast if you're not ready for it.
I've got a good one for our 250th anniversary here. I wrote this book, Young Washington. In fact, there's a movie coming out July 3rd. They've used my book as a source, but it's not, it's not like film based on when George Washington was, this young guy in the wilderness, the Ohio wilderness, and he was getting involved not only in fighting in the French and Indian War. He actually got involved in starting the French and Indian War, but on one of his early,
he kind of started it. No, I mean, folks, read the book, but George Washington started the French and Indian War by both delivery and by attitude. Yeah,
and by attitude. But before he started the French and Indian War, he was on a mission, as his first real mission into the wilderness, and in the course of it, there's a whole long backstory that we've talked about in the past. But in the course of it, he ends up falling off of a raft into a frozen river, and a river with ice flows in it. And he manages to get back to the raft, and fortunately, he has a experienced wilderness guide with him, a very experienced wilderness guide named Christopher Gist, and Gist gets the raft to an island. They're getting bashed around by ice in this big river, and they get to an island, and that Gist clearly gets a fire started, because there's no way George Washington was going to get that fire started. And that even then, Washington kept a journal, and he wrote in retrospect. He said, "Well, Mr. Gist froze his fingers and toes at this moment," and that I think what happened. I'm sure what happened. I'm sure George Washington would have died right there if Christopher Gist had not been with him. I'm utterly convinced. And so here, I don't know where we'd be 250 years later, maybe in a whole different situation. And that Christopher Gist clearly got the fire started and warmed up George Washington to the point where he could function. Otherwise, that would have been the end.
And what people don't realize too, I just had the chance of watching Sully again, the plane going into the Hudson. People don't realize that those people were rescued in less than 24 minutes. And there were people that, had they not been rescued, that could have turned very dark very, very quickly.
Very quickly.
People are like, well, they're in the water. They're just waiting for people to pick them up. I'm like, it was the Hudson River in New York winter. And had it gone on an hour, or had the crews that showed up that actually rescued the few people that had gone into the water not gotten there in the time they got there, there's a whole section in Last Breath about all of those men. It was 16 men, I think you talk about. 15 of them go down, get dried off, get warmed up, get coffee, get, hot cocoa, whatever it is. And they all walk back downstairs, and they're all dead. And the one guy who actually stayed on the deck slowly warming up is the one guy that lived, because there's a science to it now that we understand in regards to exposure, because sometimes our attempts to ameliorate what has happened to us because of exposure when we get lost ends up being as destructive to us as the thing itself. That's why Roosevelt ended up as handicapped as he did, because a lot of bad decisions were made in the aftermath of his polio onset. And so that people make these kind of rash decisions in an attempt to save themselves, and actually make the situation worse because it comes from panic. And that's the thing about a surprise. Being lost by surprise is the same as falling into frozen water, unexpectedly falling into frozen water. I mean, it's not the same physical sensation, but it's the same sort of panic, and you make bad decisions. I think when you go out, not to get lost, but go out with the expectation that loss is a possibility, you're removing panic from the equation. I think when you go out and don't expect to get lost is when panic sets in, because you can't get your bearings and you've not accepted being lost as a potential reality.
And I think you can extend that metaphorically too, to situations where you're going into a risky situation. I mean, it could be financially, it could be emotionally, it could be any number of things, and that I find it's really helpful to have a backup plan. Like, okay, if this doesn't work out, I guess I'm thinking especially financially these days, or not these days.
Getting a little too close to home. Getting a little too close to home.
But it's like, okay, I have plan A, like for where we are financially, and then and as a writer, it's a very uncertain income as a freelance writer, and I feel very lucky that I've been able to get as far as I have. But you never know, and when that can turn around. And so it's like I have plan A financially, then I have plan B, backup plan, then I have plan C to backup plan B, then I have plan D, and I think I've got it down to plan E now. E, F. What comes after F, G? No, down to F. Yeah, I got it down to plan
just don't get down to preparation H. That's all.
Okay, all right, we won't get down.
That's an Elston Powers joke, and I apologize for nothing. but you can extend the metaphor, because the idea, and I will tell you this. Okay, this is something we should probably have a show about too, in the regards to getting lost can build character if it is survived. Because you make a really good point that if you've ever really been lost in the wilderness and really exposed as you have, as many people, look, we can make the case we go back to Washington again, 250 years, right? We can go back to Washington and make the same case. You can make a case that as badly as he blunders so much of that fateful trip that you cover in the book, it sets up life lessons for later. Roosevelt's trip to the Badlands sets up life lessons for later. Right. The idea that, like, when you've been, on the edge of a cliff, and your compass is lying to you, Peter. I'm sorry, you have a lying compass. Yeah. I'm gonna keep bringing that joke.
It does that all the time.
All the time. But when you survive those kind of things, it makes it easier to face the potential of financial ruin. It makes it easier to face the potential of being lost in your relationships, because in many ways you've been through you come up to the edge of the last breath and that last empty place, and that makes. It makes a big difference. I mean, like I said, that's I think it's why people gravitate. Kind of go back to your gravitational pull. Those men, those women, those human beings, and I love this expression, who rally around you and who rally around what it is what it is you're selling, what it is you're living, what it is you're doing. I think a lot of them understand that what they're really looking for, many of them, not all of them, but I think a lot of those people are looking for ways to challenge themselves at the extreme, so that the measure of living their life on a daily basis becomes far more manageable.
Well, that's a really interesting equation that you lay out there, and I think it's true, and that having been through those experiences is good preparation for anything. I mean, literally anything. I think that one of the most key issues is to know that you have a backup plan when you find yourself in these really what's that?
A contingency
when you find yourself in those situations, and then you're much less inclined to panic. The panic doesn't come rushing at you.
You don't give up.
You didn't because you didn't expect it. No, you've expected it. You've anticipated it. I've said, I don't know how many times I've said to myself, and sometimes camping, backpacking with wife and children, and how many times I've said, well, if the worst comes to worst, we can camp right here and we'll be okay. And a few years ago, that almost happened up on a mountaintop. It was a pretty dicey going for a while when a storm blew in at the same time dark blew in.
Oh, well, that's a crazy thing too, because there's a wonderful, charming comedy by a guy named Nunnally Johnson called Mr. Hobbs Takes a Vacation. It's one of my favorite movies. And one of the really fun things about the movie, Jimmy Stewart plays Mr. Hobbs, takes his whole family to the beach. And one of the fun things about the movie is that his wife and his family think that he is a better sailor than he actually is. He doesn't claim to be a good sailor. They all just said that, he was did boating when he was a kid,
Right.
where he grew up. And so they're constantly doing that. One of the running gags in the movie, Peter, is that we actually get his interior monologue.
Oh,
So it has that thing of, it's really funny of him, like, people making comments and then him, but it's not him thinking aloud. It is him narrating himself. So at one point, he and his son get on this really small dinghy, and they get lost in the fog. And then they're almost hit by a giant ship that comes out of the fog. And they're
I've been
lost.
in that place too.
They're lost. And there's a moment where his son looks really panicked. And then Jimmy Stewart sees his son panicked. And he says, no, Bud, you don't understand. He said, I was a little worried there myself, pal. I was worried there myself. He said, but he said that boat that we just saw, that was headed out. So I know for a fact now we're headed in. And then he says that, and then his interior narration says, an inbound freighter said he saw the little dinghy he almost hit, headed out to sea. It was the last time it had ever been seen. And he keeps his son calm, though. But we watch it happening. And you brought this up with your own kids and your family, the idea that it's like, when you're out there by yourself, there's a certain panic or a certain loneliness or a certain thing. But when you're out there with other people and they're depending upon you to show the way, the guide, the Christopher Guests, Sacagawea. I mean, we can go on for a while. The people who are responsible for getting you where you're supposed to get, the scouts, the guides, all those people, and you become a scout and a guide. So you're not just getting lost. Peter Stark isn't getting lost. Amy's getting lost. Skylar's getting lost. Everybody's getting lost, man. Everybody's getting lost, and you become.
And they're counting on you
to find them.
Yeah. What's the name of the Jimmy Stewart movie I want to watch?
Mr. Hobbs Takes a Vacation. And by the way, Peter, I couldn't recommend it enough for you in regards to, it is really a piece of. It's a great piece of dessert is the best way I can kind of describe it. There's another great scene too where he has to get up early. He has to meet the new in-laws, and one of the two people is a bird watcher. So he has to go birding with this guy, and it's so up your alley. I
can imagine Jimmy Stewart's take on this as an actor that he's so good in those stumbling situations.
Yeah. And anybody that's ever had a teenage daughter, which you have had, will find the scene at the dance at the yacht club.
Oh,
incredibly. Okay. And I'm talking about a post-World War II yacht club. I don't mean like, what these high-powered things. I'm talking about, they're distinctively middle-class people. In this
summer vacation yacht club.
Yeah.
It's funny that we're actually getting near the end of our segment here. But when you talk about Jimmy Stewart and his son in a little dinghy being lost in the fog, sometime you asked me about with my ex-girlfriend and being invited on a sailing trip and getting lost in the fog at night somewhere off Nantucket. That's the story.
Next time we just do a show, I'm just going to jump in and start off with that.
Okay, and then we can launch from now on.
The other thing I wanted to kind of talk about, we didn't get a chance to kind of touch on today on Last Empty Places with Peter Stark and Jimmy Mack is, and I will get to this at some point, either in the next episode or the one after that. We're going to be lining up some guests here, guys, over the next coming weeks as well, too, as Peter continues his book tour. I'm also going to have an announcement next time, Peter, about my own newsletter, Gauge Illuminations, which is going to keep people up to date about not only this show, but all the other things that I'm doing. So she's 58 years old. She's got a 2-pack a day smoking habit. She's got high blood pressure. Her name is Polly Melton, and she wasn't very fast, and life had kind of beaten her down. But on September 25th of 81, she was hiking with 2 friends on the North Carolina side of the Great Smoky Mountains, and Melton began power walking, just kind of took off on a power walk in front of her friends. And one of them called out to her, I wouldn't want to be in a foot race with you, Polly. Melton turns, Polly turns, laughs, and keeps on going. She disappears over a crest in the gravel hiking trail that wound through the mountains, but I'm talking about a public trail. And when her friends came down on the other side, they expected to see Melton catching her breath on one of the public benches because she's a 58-year-old smoker. I will end my part of this time that we spent together by simply saying Polly Melton was never seen again, and there isn't a lick of evidence to suggest what it was that happened to her. So, like I said, people get lost all the time. They wander off, and they are never seen again. And we'll talk more about that next time. We'll let you guys know what's coming up down the way. I'm Jimmy Mack. That's Peter Stark. It's good to see you, brother.
Yeah, good to see you. I'm glad we're back in the saddle here.
We'll talk to you next time on Last Empty Places. Now here's Clare Marie with a little bit of information you sure could use.
The Last Empty Places is a Planet Clare production and lives at peterstarkauthor.com. Listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all your favorite platforms. Write to us on the contact page at peterstarkauthor.com. And in the meantime, head on out and find an adventure.